Okay, so we're going to begin getting into connecting principles. As we talked about earlier, we have the different principles in the TBRI model. We start with connecting principles because that's really the crux of the foundation of what everything else is built on, because as we talked about, relationships are what are most important, and certainly healing comes through relationships, and unfortunately trauma and damage can come through relationships as well. So as we get into the connecting principles, some terms that we're going to be talking about that I want to make sure that I highlight and help you all understand. We're going to talk about mindfulness strategies. We're going to talk about engagement strategies. We'll talk a little bit about the attachment cycle. We'll talk about concepts of self-worth and self-efficacy. We'll also be talking about the ability to self-regulate. And then we'll be getting into some basic neurophysiology. We'll be talking about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, and talking a little bit about excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. So, as I mentioned here in the overview, of course, we talked about the three areas of connecting, empowering, and correcting. And what we're going to be focusing on at this point is an overview of the connecting principles. And then in later subsequent trainings, we'll get into these other areas as well. So let me take a minute to talk a little bit about mindfulness strategies. So obviously when we're talking about relating to children or any type of relationship, it's always a two-way process. So obviously we're bringing ourselves to the relationship, and then that other person is interacting with us. And so one of the things that we need to think about when we are working with children, whether we're a therapist or foster parent or whatever our role is, in coming at that relationship from two different directions, when we think about mindfulness strategies, we're talking about what's going on inside of us. So we're thinking about, what am I bringing to a relationship? What's going on with me? How am I feeling right now? So taking a look at what we're doing. And then engagement strategies are ways to intentionally focus on how to better connect with a child, and focusing on kind of what's going on with them and what do they need. Now, interestingly, a lot of times in parenting, there's a lot of focus on looking at the child and looking at their behavior and looking at what's going on with them and looking at what their problems or issues are, and clearly that's important. But the other piece that sometimes is not talked about as much is the mindful piece. And so it's very, very important for us, as we're thinking about interacting with children, to think about what's going on with us, so we can focus at and look at what we're putting into the relationship. So the TBRI connecting principles are the foundation of TBRI, as I mentioned. They're designed to provide parents with knowledge and tools and relate deeply to their children. During the first year of life, the attachment cycle sets the stage for the development of important personal and interpersonal skills. So the brain best functions and is optimized and develops best in the context of good relationships. So the better connection that children have with their caregivers, then the better their brains are going to develop. We'll talk about the attachment cycle, which is that process of the unfolding process of the parent and the child connecting and relating to each other. If that cycle doesn't go well, if that cycle is disrupted, then we can see some pretty significant negative changes in the brain. We can see some areas that do not develop correctly. And that then, the correlates of that a lot of times will be behavioral and emotional difficulties in children. As we talked about before, of course the brain, especially when we're talking about children, is plastic or has plasticity. It can be formed, it can be shaped, it can be changed. And so the good thing is that even if initially a child has come into the world and there's been some significant disruptions in their attachment system, if they can encounter good, nurturing, loving relationship, then a lot of that damage can be undone. When children lose their voices to abuse or neglect, when they express themselves, whether it's crying, whether it's telling someone that they have a need, depending on their age, And if they do not get an appropriate response back, then we talk about that they lose their voice. In other words, another way of thinking about it is what I say or what I do doesn't matter. It doesn't put an end to the bad things that are happening to me. So a core focus of connection then is helping that child to gain voice again so that they can begin to understand, if I say something, if I express a need, it's going to be met. And that may seem pretty basic to people that have grown up in a fairly normal environment, but for the kids that we work with that come from hard places, a lot of times that whole process has not gone well. And so when they have expressed a need, those needs are not consistently met, so we see a lot of children that have significant trust issues. So when we think about the mindfulness strategies, this is now focusing on the caregiver. This is focusing on the adult that's interacting with the child. One extremely important piece of the puzzle in understanding ourselves is examining our own past. Our brains are historical organs, so they store experiences. And those experiences, good or bad, have a huge impact on how we respond then in the present. It's very common for parents that have a unresolved, or caregivers that have an unresolved trauma history, that if they're dealing with a child that has significant problems, that those child's behaviors, those child's reactions, those child's expressions a lot of times can trigger the caregiver's traumatic past. And if it hasn't been worked through, that can create problems. So obviously what we're striving for then is mindful interaction. So we want caregivers to be fully aware of what's going on with them so that they can more effectively interact with the children that they're caring for. Some of the things that we talk about when we're focused on the engagement piece of the puzzle, looking more at the child and what they need and how can we best interact with them. One important concept is attunement. So is that caregiver in tune with what's going on with the child? Is that, children don't need us to be near them or around them. They need us to be with them. So children need us to be in tune with them, connected with them, to understand what's going on with them. And so a well-attuned caregiver is able to understand and realize what's going on with the child. And then the better attunement, the better connection, the better awareness they have of what's going on with the child, the more effective they're going to interact. Nurturing touch. One of the main ways that our nervous system is calmed back down when we get upset is touch. So if you think about infants, for example, and they cry and they get upset, one of the main ways that an infant is calmed back down, usually their parent will pick them up, rock them, touch them, caress them, and calm them back down. So nurturing touch is a huge component of being able to help a child feel that they're being connected with, to feel they're being understood, and to help them calm back down. Now, obviously we have to be careful in using touch, because some kids that we're dealing with maybe have had hurtful touch or inappropriate touch. And so they may not have a good concept of, they still need touch because we all need it, but they may not have a good concept of knowing what healthy touch feels like. And so we have to be cognizant of that. The other thing we have to be aware of is that every child is different. And some of you in this room can probably relate to this. Some people are very touchy, they like a lot of touch, and other people are not as comfortable with it. And so we have to make sure that if we're using nurturing touch with a child, that we're doing that appropriately, and we're not overwhelming the child, especially when children go into that fight, flight, or freeze, when they get really dysregulated. There are some children that if you touch them, it will just make them more dysregulated. So a lot of times we have to do kind of a pseudo touch, where we'll put our hand underneath their chin but not actually touch them and say, can you give me eyes? Will you look at me? So you have to be real aware of the child you're dealing with and making sure that you're using touch in a way that is not overwhelming to them. Okay? Warm eyes. That's another thing we can do, obviously, and a lot of how we care about another person, what we're thinking about another person is conveyed through nonverbal. And so if we give a warm eyes, warm expression, that's going to help the child feel comfortable. We also have to think about our voice quality, right? So obviously if a child is upset, one of the things that we know is that the thinking part of their brain, the frontal lobe area, a lot of times when kids are upset, or really any human beings, the frontal lobe's not working as well. So they don't have as much access to language abilities and making sense of things. So if we're talking quickly, if we're talking loudly and the child's upset, they're not going to hear much of what we say, and it may even overwhelm them more. So voice quality is very important. If a child is upset, we want to be speaking very plainly, softly, not trying to say a lot of things. At the same time, if we have a child that is beginning to escalate, but is not to the point of overwhelm yet, we may have to use a different voice quality to get their attention and help them recognize that they're starting to spiral, so that maybe we get them to calm back down. Playful engagement. It is much easier to correct a child's behavior if they haven't gotten into overwhelm yet, if we can do it playfully. So the other day, my son Elliot had left his bunch of stuff out in the kitchen, and I came back and I said, Elliot, I'm sorry we didn't get to get those expensive tea containers that once they get used, they can detect they're empty and they throw themselves in the trash can. You have to pick that up and do that yourself. So if we can find ways to be to playfully engage with children while we're correcting them or informing them, we're gonna get a whole lot better response, obviously. Now sometimes, and we'll get into that later, sometimes we have to move beyond playful engagement. We have to do a little bit more directive kind of approach. But if we can catch a child early on in that process of needing to correct them in some way, and they're not in overwhelm yet, playful engagement can be very successful. Okay, so next we're going to watch this video on the attachment cycle.